This is Adrian Shepard with Springtime Nations. I'm here with Kevin Flanagan of the Brehon Academy, or how exactly do you pronounce it?
Hi,
Brehon.
Adrian. Yeah, that's right. Brehon, that's as good as it gets. Yeah, Brehon.
Great. And your main focus with the Brehon Academy is the study of medieval Ireland, its culture, and especially its legal framework. Is that correct?
That's right. I mean, I cover a very large span of history, not just medieval Ireland, but um, we're kind of based on the source material that we have available to us. And for the legal research, that actually goes as far back as the 6th, 7th century when we start to get the legal manuscript. So I'll just deal with the early Ireland. So pretty much up until around the 17th century, I would cover up until then, and then even a little on up to the modern time, because um, the story of Irish law and the conflict between the two systems existed, up until even 100 years ago, and some might say it even exists to this day.
Right. So the reason that most listeners, as libertarians, will be familiar, at least somewhat, with the Brehon Law, the Irish medieval or pre-medieval law, because it's a polycentric legal order. There's no one set authority, and this is used as an example of how law could look in a stateless society. So this law, it lasts until the English, later the British, impose a monocentric legal order. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. Yeah.
How smooth was this transition? Did one day England manage to one day just this was a long process, I understand, over centuries, but
Yeah.
at some point England controlled all of Ireland, and at that point there was no more polycentric. It was all from London. Is
Yeah.
that really how it?
Yeah. Let me unpack a bit of that. I mean, you're right. It is spanning several centuries. I mean, the first Anglo-Normans came to Ireland in 1169. And there's a whole story about their history in Ireland, to the point where we have many names in Ireland today which would be of Anglo-Norman origin. However, we don't think of them as being any less Irish. And names like Fitzgerald, for example, and one of the most famous Americans with the Fitzgerald name was John Fitzgerald Kennedy, but Fitzgerald would have been originally an Anglo-Norman name. So there's a lot of history in between that period of 1169 up until, I believe it was, and I might be getting the years just a couple of years wrong here, but I think it was 1604 or 1605 when we have what was called the Flight of the Earls. And there's a lot of history in those centuries to kind of unpack and give a clear idea of what was going on. But you're hitting on a kind of a nerve point of all of this study, which is the legal systems. Most of the time when people think about the conflict in Ireland, which still exists, there's still 6 counties that belong to the British Empire, or to the British. They usually think that it's got to do with religion. And in its later centuries, it was a lot to do with religion. Ever since Henry VIII converted, he left the Catholic Church because he wasn't able to remarry. He started the Anglican Church. And then from then on, you have the English Protestants, so to speak. And so a lot of the time, this conflict is characterized as a clash between two religions. But when you do a deeper dive into the history, you realize that for a long period of that history, they were all Catholic, the Irish and the English, because there wasn't really any Protestant church at the time. And you have to then question, well, why was there such a conflict here then? Why were these two cultures, these two people, seemingly so incompatible with each other? And my theory is that well, we understand that conflict when we look at the clash between the two legal systems, because they were so different from each other. You're kind of brushing against it there with this idea of the monarchical rule, where one man, it was usually a man at the time, would have the right to rule just because he was the eldest born son of the existing ruler. In Ireland, the system was entirely different than that. I mean, even to become a chieftain, you had to be elected chieftain and anybody who was an eligible male within the tribe. Let's just use the word tribe for shorthand. Anybody within the tribe could be elected to that position if they were eligible and they fulfill certain characteristics. So this idea of primogeniture was very alien to the Irish. Even the idea of having like children outside of wedlock, so to speak, you had this concept of the recognized son. So there was more, I think, like early Ireland, and the further back you go, the less Christian it is. Like there was a bit of even polyamorous relationships where a chieftain could have many wives, and there's even accounts of women who had more than one husband. So even like the concept of marriage was very different, and how they did law was extremely different. Where in the monarchical system, and pretty much that's the system that we have inherited today in the West, especially common law jurisdictions like Ireland, UK, and America, for the most part, is a common law jurisdiction, is kind of like a remnant of this type of rule where the king had the authority to decree that such and such a thing was now a law, and it was by decree that it was law. And in that sense, I describe this system that we've inherited from British rule as a fiat system. There were laws because somebody who was deemed to have authority said so. Whereas in the Irish system, the laws were emergent. And what does that mean? It means that it wasn't like a council of judges and kings sitting around saying, okay, the people should behave in such and such a manner. Although the kings in Ireland had a very important part in upholding the legal structure, it was emergent because these were customs that were in use for such a long time that people in the society could feel like they could rely on those principles. They could rely on these certain norms, let's say. And over the course of time, when a norm had been in place for such a long time, which was about 90 years, to the Irish, they called it since time immemorial. So when a custom had been around since before anybody could remember, which would be about 3 generations or roughly 90 years, something like that, then it was deemed to be a norm. It was deemed to be the way things are, the order of things. And then we have this class of individuals. The early Irish loved learning, and we get a sense of that when we know that they were referred to as the island of saints and of scholars. So there was a real love for learning and the written word that kind of carried through into the culture. And that's why we have so many manuscripts from those times. And we have manuscripts on all manner of details of life, even down to beekeeping and so on. So it's because of that love of learning that they were exploring these different ways of doing society and writing it all down. But there was a class of individuals who we would call Brehons, which is where the term Brehon law actually comes from. And that's from the Irish word brihv, which is a word for a judge. And we still use that word for a judge today in Ireland. So when you say Brehon, that was how it was anglicized, according to their pronunciation. And they seen that these judges were so important in the society that they termed it the Brehon law. Although the Irish wouldn't have called it the Brehon law. They would have referred to the different types, or let's say, different manuscripts that govern the different parts of life. And there was a law called the Fennicus, which was kind of the law of the free man. A fenny was a free farmer, and everybody was a farmer back then, if you can imagine, like it was an agricultural society. So the fenny were free men who had land and who farmed their land, and it was really the common law of Ireland was the Fennicus. Then you also had the Filidiocht, it was called, and that was the law of the poets and the learned classes. And then there was a canon law that was more to do with the church. So this was very, very intricate. A lot of detail went into it. And when you read these manuscripts today, you really get a sense of how meticulous they were at trying to take account of all the varying circumstances and the varying status that somebody might have, and then to try and pronounce a judgment based on those customs and those norms that were already existing among the society. And they did this always in the form of a poem, which I always thought was quite beautiful. They would give a judgment in the form of a poem, and they would try their best to link it back to some precedent. So that would either be the mythological stories of Ireland, would give them precedents for how a case should be judged. But it could also be from the world around them, in the natural world. They would look for principles that were they considered a part of the natural order of things, and they would try to introduce that into the judgment that they were given, into the reasoning of the judgment that they were given. So that's kind of a very brief sort of overview of the system and how it was, the beginning of how it was different from the monarchical systems.
Great. That raises a bunch of questions. Just a quick one I want to get out of the way. You mentioned that there was a canon law for the church. Obviously, we're talking about Roman Catholic clergy. Did the church in Ireland have basically the same kind of hierarchical legal system for the church, or was there a distinct Irish decentralized flavor to it?
This is a topic that it wouldn't be the one that I know the most about, but what I can say is that there was a period in history when the Catholic Church wasn't as well established as it became. And first you had it as the Roman Empire, of course, and then the Roman Empire fell, which is interesting for Irish history because the Roman Empire never got as far as Ireland. And that's another reason why a lot of these manuscripts and traditions continued on for much longer, and even the genealogies of Irish kings can be dated back much, much further than other European countries, because we didn't have Roman Empire here. But there was a time, just what we call the Irish Christian Church. And my understanding of it, and it is limited, but my understanding is that church would have been kind of more what we would look as the Orthodox churches. Like you had the Greek Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox churches, where they have their own kind of patriarch that's independent of Rome. And the Irish church would have been a bit more like this. And even to the point where Easter was celebrated at a different time. And obviously Easter is one of the most significant holidays for the Christian calendar. So the fact that it was celebrated on a different time of the year was very significant at that time. And even today, the Orthodox churches of the East will celebrate Christmas and Easter at different times. And they were calculating it based on some astrological movements. I'm not sure if it's like to do with the full moon or to do with like the sun, where like the movement of the sun. But Easter is always based on astrological alignment, which is why it's on a different date every year. And the Irish church at that time was, how can I say, it was much more, it's going to sound weird to mix these two concepts together, but much more pagan in nature, much more nature-based. I mean, we can read the stories and the accounts of the early Irish Christian saints. And what most people don't realize, I know it's like coming up to St. Patrick's Day, there were Christians in Ireland before St. Patrick arrived. I mean, he was charged with coming to Ireland to preach to the Christians already there. But the conception of Christianity was very different than what we think of as the Catholic Church today, with their rituals and their saints and so on. That was something that, and we are talking about a large period of time, like from the 5th century upwards, up till the modern day. There's a lot of time there for things to change. So the early Irish church was a lot more nature-based. It had a lot of influence from the religion that already existed here, which would have been, we don't know much about it, but we do know that there were Druids, and a lot of those Druids would have become the monks and the early scribes and so on. And it was the monks that wrote down all of our legends and histories. So they were aware of these things. They were aware of the oral tradition, and it was them who actually wrote it down into manuscripts. So they were not so far removed from it that they were trying to kind of whitewash it. Now, I know that there'll be people probably listening to this who, and there are people in Ireland who are like offended by what the Catholic Church did in this country and how it, in their mind, would have like eradicated the old culture. And it's an interesting story about two empires, really, the Holy Roman Empire and the British Empire. And it got to a point where it became very politically charged as well. So the Irish chieftains who were Catholic would have been asking the Spanish Catholics and the French Catholics for help in different rebellions or wars that they were planning to wage. So it became an identity, a factor of identity much later. But if we go back to St. Columba, who was a very famous Irish monk, he had a monastery in Iona. There was a period in history where this monastery in Iona was vying with the Catholic Church to be the central place of all Christian worship. Like, that's how significant the early Irish Church was, that it presumed to claim a right to be the center of all Christendom. And we could dive into this a bit more if we wanted to, but when you look at the canon law that was issued by the Vatican, the first invasion of Ireland was sanctioned by the Vatican, and the wording of it was, to get rid of the barbarous customs that the Irish had, to preach the true gospel, which was obviously the Latin version of when Mass should happen and how it should happen and the holy days, but also to collect a tax of 1 penny per every household. And this was given to, I think it was Henry II, as a permission from the church. And when you follow that history through, always keeping an eye on what the church is doing in the background, when the Protestant church began and you now had English royalty claiming the right to be called King and Queen of Ireland, that wasn't the case beforehand. They were just the Lord of Ireland. That was a title given to them by the Vatican. It seems that the Vatican never condemned any of their actions in Ireland, at least not in those early days, because the way I look at it is that the kind of feeling was, it can be anything as long as it's not Gaelic. It can be Roman and it can be Protestant, but it can't be Gaelic, because there's other reasons for that as well. And I'll just mention this, and maybe feel free to guide me where you'd like us to go any deeper. But like I mentioned already, the Irish genealogies of kings are much, much more ancient than other European nations, because we didn't have to follow Rome. But that's interesting, because at that time in history, in order to be the king or the queen of a country, you had to have the holy men put the crown on your head. So you were ordained by the bishops. But in Ireland, they didn't need to get that authority from the Pope, because we had traditions that far predated these things. So it's like in Ireland, the man was elected the king because he was elected by his people, and he stood on the ancient rock where his forefathers had been inaugurated in the past, and he turned around 3 times and he blessed the land, and that was enough for him to be king. But so that's interesting, because the right to kingship, the right to rule, really, in early Ireland in those days, it didn't come from the Vatican. There was no need to ask for the Pope to give a blessing, and that was a threat to the Vatican order and its control that it was establishing over Europe as the Holy Roman Empire. But you have interesting interchange between the clan system, the Tuatha system in Ireland, and the church, where you would have people who might be eligible for king, to be elected to king, or have high positions in society, would opt to go into the church instead. And to be in the church was considered a great a duty, but it was also a very highly privileged position. And that saint that I mentioned, Saint Columba, he would have been of royalty from the Owenacht tribe, and he could have been eligible to be elected as a king, but he went into the church instead. So at certain parts of the history, you do see a great mixture between church life, quote unquote church life, and the social life of the time. So there was definitely differences, but as we go through the centuries, those differences were kind of weeded out, and the Irish Catholics kind of came under the order of Rome and under the rituals and the observances that they had in the Catholic Church of Rome.
I'm glad we actually explored this a little bit, because it also kind of pours water on the idea that this is simply a religious conflict rather than a clash of 2 different frames of living.
Yeah.
When Ireland finally becomes, a dominion of the British Empire, Do the Brehons just go away? Did they
Mm.
simply did they find some other role in society, or were they exterminated? What is the post Brehon
Yeah.
Ireland looking like?
Okay, so we're in the period now of the 17th century, and I need to do a little bit of backtracking on this. So Ireland in the early times was not, it was a unified country, as a unified nation of people. So they knew that they had the same language, that they were the same people, but they didn't think of themselves as like, they weren't flying under the same flag. There was no state, as you mentioned at the start. They didn't have a state. So what was the conception of statehood in Ireland was there was actually over 100 what we would call petty kingdoms or big tribes, powerful tribes. And it was hierarchical in the sense that if I was the king of a Tua, this tribe was called a Tua, which is also translated as a land or a people. So it kind of gives you an idea that to the early Irish, this idea of being tied to the land and the people of that land were the kind of rulers of that land. So you had hundreds of them, but they would always pay, like the smaller ones would have an over king, so to speak, that they would pay some tribute to, and it went up the chain. Eventually you got to the High King of Ireland. But even then, the High King of Ireland's position was always challenged, and it was never like set in stone. And it required the support of the families below him in order to keep that position. And why is this important? Well, the Irish concept of sovereignty, I think, is a more interesting way to think about it than we say, oh, they were anarchists. I often say like anarchist Ireland, but that's just kind of to get people's attention. They certainly didn't think of themselves as anarchists, and they certainly wouldn't have thought of like liberty was their value. At least like we don't see that in the sense that we talk about today. They believed in their land and their people, and there was a sovereignty attached to that, and that by right of ancestry and by right of like your people have been there for so long that that was considered your land. And we even have counties in Ireland. I can give you an example of Tyrone, which that's the English way to say it, but the Irish way is Tír Owen, which is the land of Owen, the land of Owen and Owen's descendants. Offaly as well is the Ufeli, which is another county in the center of the country. And that was like the Faili people, right? And the descendants of these tribes of people. And they were considered to have sovereignty in their own right. And why is this important? Well, it goes back to the rituals of election that we talked about, that in order to become the chieftain, which in Irish we call a Taoiseach, and today, I don't know if you're aware of this, but we call our prime minister the Taoiseach. And that's why, because it goes back to those old traditions. They had the right to rule, and they had the title to the land, so to speak, because they were elected according to the Irish customs. Now, there was a period in history, and I think this would have been around the 1500s, when in order to kind of subdue the Irish tribes, who were not just only fighting against the British, wherever they had a chance, every generation pretty much rose up in arms to fight against. They never really had control of Ireland, because they never got the spirit of Ireland. People were always ready to fight against it, but they were also fighting against themselves. And that's one of the tragedies of Irish history, is that, you know, the Vikings managed to get a good foothold in Ireland because the Irish families were more interested in fighting their old feuds than fighting off the Vikings, until it got so bad that Brian Boru, he raised up the clans in the 1300s and fought back against them. So there was always this difficulty that they had with governing Ireland, until you had this policy from the British that was called surrender and regrant. And what happened in surrender and regrant was they surrendered their title and their right to their lands, and it was regranted back to them, the same lands, but the title was now Earl, which is a British title from the British Crown. So you can see there, and there's a lot to unpack with that, actually, this idea of surrender and regrant. You can see the British efforts to bring the Irish under the dominion of the English through negotiation, and saying, hey, look, we don't want your lands. You can still be the chief of your lands. I'm doing bunny quotes here, chief, but you're going to be called the Earl. and your authority now comes from the monarch. And one by one, different chieftains did this over the course of a few hundred years, because human nature is what it is, and they want to protect their lands. So that was a way for them to do that, that they wouldn't have to fight the British, that their title to the land would be protected by the British now. So if I'm the Earl of, say, Balbriggan, where I am at the moment, then and somebody, an Irish clan that's not under the British dominion, tries to attack me to take my land and title, the British would have helped me. So there's a little bit of self-interest, a lot of self-interest wrapped up in this as well, that they made the choice to become Earls and relinquish their Irish titles in order that the British could claim dominion over those lands. And why is that important? Well, it's important because now, once they had surrender and regrant, once they had surrendered and gotten the title of an Earl, now they were under the British law, and that meant primogeniture existed. So now it was their eldest son that would be, by right, they would inherit the title of Earl upon the death of the father. Now they're automatically, right away, the Earl, no interruption of the legal entity, like of the legal entity of being a title of an Earl. It just passed on to the next in line. So that meant that all of the arrangements, the contracts, the duties that were attached to that title now passed on to the son without interruption. And before that, if the British Crown had made a contract with a chieftain of an Irish tribe and that chieftain died, so did the contract. The contract died with that man, because he was only like making the commitments based on his own authority, and he passed away. And then the title of chieftain, it might not go to his son, it might go to his nephew or his cousin or something like that. So the British would have to, in theory then, well, legally speaking, it's not in theory, like from a legal point of view, they would have to go back in and they would have to renegotiate, and they would have to get that person to come under the dominion. So by having the surrender and regrant, it was actually a master stroke legally that they could ensure that the dominion of Britain wouldn't be interrupted when the chieftain that they made the contract with died, because now they're an Earl. So that's important, because slowly, all of the country, these old chieftains, these old nobility, let's say the ancient Irish nobility, they started to adopt the English title. And with that, also English customs and English way of doing things. And it was sort of seen that like the Irish way of doing things was barbaric and the English way was refined or something like that. And that's all important to give some subtext, because to how the law ended, because it was in the Battle of Kinsale in 1604, I think. I think the battle was in 1604 and they fled in 1605. But the last of the Irish chieftains to bend the knee, so to speak, were actually the ones in Ulster, which is the north of the country. It was the O'Neills and the O'Donnells, and they refused to give in to the British threats and the wars that were happening. There was rebellions and everything like that. They refused to give up their Gaelic culture, and they went to have a big battle that would have been quite decisive either way. There was a problem though. They asked the Spanish, I think it was the Spanish, it could have been the French, they asked them for help, and they did send soldiers to help fight in this battle, but the soldiers landed in the south of the country, not in the north of the country where the chieftains were. And so once they got news of this, they had to march very quickly across. It's not a huge country, but to walk across the terrain in those days, it would have been challenging. They marched from the north of the country down to the south to face the British in battle, and they were very badly defeated. And this is kind of a turning point in Gaelic Ireland. This was a point where, after they fled, that's what the flight of the Earls was, the last remaining chieftains or Earls of the old families, they took into boats and they sailed off to Spain, and to even some went to Rome. They went to the Catholic countries, and the idea was, we're going to go there and we're going to get support and we're going to come back and we're going to fight for Ireland. That never happened. They never came back. And there's a lot of like ways to slice that part of our history, you know. So it's a really tragic part of our history, but then there's some people who might look at the Earls as being quite selfish, and that they just wanted to protect their own skins and their own titles. But it was in Gaelic society, the chieftains would have been the ones who kind of maintained the order. So they would have had Brehons in their retinue, in their courts, that they would have like taken care of, and they would have provided them with somewhere to like land and resources and everything like that. And that was the same not just for the Brehons, but also the poets and the musicians and the genealogists. And like a king's court, they had all of these officers. And once that order was finally destroyed and it was now under the dominion of Britain, these people started to drop in status. Like they had no one to protect them. They had no one to like maintain order, so to speak. And we enter a period then of great discrimination called the Penal laws. And this was really when Irish culture was eradicated. I'm sitting here speaking English to you, but I'm not able to speak Irish, even though I learned it in school for 12 years. Most Irish people, they're not able to speak their own language. So you have to really think about what needs to happen to a people. How brutal does it need to be where they actually lose their own language? They lost how to call, like they started anglicizing their surnames to be more British sounding. There was actually a decree by one of the kings of law where all Irish people were supposed to change their surname away from being an Irish one towards being something that was more amenable to British mouths, that they could say it and they could read it. So that period then, really from the 17th century up until the 18th century, was a very dark period for Irish, and I'm thinking of Irish Catholics here. That's when their land was taken off them, when they became an island of peasant farmers, tenants, where their knowledge of their history was taken. The very knowledge of like where they had come from, their genealogy, and that they were once descended from chieftains and kings was completely taken. Their language was taken from them. They weren't allowed to educate their own children in schools. And that's when we had these, what we call hedge schools, popping up. There were people hiding out in the bushes to educate their children in Irish or to teach them in Catholic ways. They weren't able to inherit, they weren't able to marry Protestants, they weren't able to have positions of authority in government, and so on. And that kind of brings us up to the later early period, if that makes sense. Like from then, from the 17th up until the 19th century, this is kind of the precursor to 1916, as well, 1878 rebellion, and then 1916 rebellion, and then the War of Independence was 1922, and so on. But so much damage had already been done to the psyche of the Irish that the early rebels who were trying to revive Irish identity again, they really just had to teach people from scratch, like, this is our language, this is our sports, here's our ancient poetry, here's how our society used to be before, because people had lost that connection to the past. And that's really tragic, you know, because you have many countries that have been colonized around the world who have their tragic stories to tell, but they can tell you in their own language. And like you look at India, for example, Hinduism is still intact. I was in Kenya last year, and you see that like the culture is still intact, even though the colonists, the French, the English, the Dutch, and so on, had been to that country and really destroyed it by dividing it up between themselves to put their monarchical law on it. Those countries still have a lot of their culture still intact. Whereas for Ireland, that's why I started the Brehon Academy, really, is to try and be a digital hedge school for people to realize and just reconnect and take an interest in this part of our history that is quite unique, and it merits study.
Yeah, you do great work there. We're big fans at Springtime of Nations of especially your poems, the poems that you've published on your YouTube channel. One of our guys is very much into poetry, so when I showed him that, he was like, "Oh, we should interview this guy."
Cool, that's cool. And listen, Adrian, if I'm talking too much, feel free to interrupt me. I am Irish and I did kiss the blinders down, so like I will just keep talking if you don't stop me, so feel free to. jump in at any point as
All
well.
right. But you've definitely everything you've been talking about is super interesting and important for I think our goal here. I wanted to ask you, okay, so there's the series of rebellions after total English domination. There's still periodic uprisings. You have it during the English Civil War. You have it during the Napoleonic Wars. You have the Fenian uprising, and of course, the Easter Rising and the Irish War of Independence. I can imagine the wars in the 1640s and 1650s. There was a great emphasis of returning to a pre-English Ireland. But as I understand it, for example, the United Irishmen were less of kind of like radical traditionalism and more like liberalism. And the Fenians, to a certain degree, were also not exactly interested in reviving Brehon Law,
Mhm.
etc., and more about just freeing Ireland being a modern liberal nation state. Is that right?
Liberal of the times. Yeah. I mean, I think that the United Irishmen are a fascinating one to study because they're united because it was Catholics and Protestants united to give Ireland an identity. And I believe like at that time, it was sort of just like a political identity that Ireland had a right to make its own laws. It had a right to govern itself. And it had a right to be recognized as a nation at the table of nations. So really what they were looking for at the time was more of independence from Westminster rule. So all of the laws of Ireland were being made by men in Westminster and in the United Kingdom who had never set foot in Ireland. And you had people like Wolfe Tone, who would have been coming from a well-off Irish background. But he was like Irish Protestants, right? And they're uniting Irish Protestants and Irish Catholics to give like this sense of identity at the table of nations. So it was much more of a political thing then. And I don't believe like they would refer back to old poems and they would use the fact that Ireland had an identity independent of Britain as a way to kind of as a banner that they could get behind, so to speak. But as I understand, there was never like efforts to completely get rid of the British Crown law. It was actually like the fact that Irish people had access to those courts at a certain point in history that made returning to the Brehon law less of a necessity because they could now go to the courts and get the judges there and so on.
Right.
Like access to English law.
And you would say in the sense that these movements did go back to pre-English. It was sort of like a mythological past and not kind of a roadmap back to what they had before.
Yeah, that's a good way of saying it. Yeah, and even in the later, like later but more recent rebellions, like if you look at the 1916 Easter Rising and look at the writings of people like Padraig Pearse, and that's one of the poems that's on the site there. It was kind of like to revive this spark of awareness in people that it was like they wanted to grab Ireland by the shoulders and say, remember who you are. Remember, we have an identity that's independent of being a British colony. And they were trying to revive that. But you're right, there was sort of this sense of like this golden age, this like mythical past, and a lot of romanticism was in the era of romanticism as well. And it's quite tempting sometimes for me to also kind of gloss over the history with those sorts of brushes and say, oh, it was a great time when, as De Valera would have said, maidens were dancing in the crossroads and this sort of thing. But with my work with the Brehon Academy, I prefer to tell it as it actually was and not as we would like it to be. And there was obviously a lot of things about the law system that wouldn't be compatible today, but I mean, that makes sense. We're talking about 1,000 years ago, and obviously things that have what worked back then are not going to be suitable today. But when you compare like for like against its contemporary systems, against the European continental systems and so on, it really stands out as a unique study, historical, anthropological, and legal, and also poetic. One of the kind of it's beautiful thing about these laws is that they were given in poetry, but that has meant that their study has been, it's hard to study them because, well, first of all, it's in an ancient language and old Irish, and not many people are speaking it. But then scholars tend to think, well, I don't know whether to treat it as poetry or whether to treat it as law. So it's kind of in this like precarious position where it's not even clear what disciplines should be the ones who study it the most. And I like to try and look at it from different points of view and say, like, okay, this is what it was like. Okay, there was kings, and what does that look like? And was it a king as we think of a king? Yes, there was hostage taking, and there was elements of slavery, not in the type of slavery that we know from like American history. And but it's important to bring these things up so we can actually parse them and say how was it actually different. And only then are we able to then look at our modern system and say, well, that piece of wisdom or that piece of knowledge or their way of approaching this particular issue might be different. We might be able to adopt something like that and modernize it so it makes our system more just, or access to justice more readily available for people.
It's also you could think of the counterfactual of, because Brehon Law is kind of, it always was an evolutionary system, how it could have evolved in, a free Ireland unimpeded. So
Yeah.
I want to jump a little ahead in time when Ireland finally does become free, or when the Republic of Ireland is proclaimed and they win the Irish War of Independence. There's a problem, right? It's the whole island does not become free. There is a part now called Northern Ireland, the 6 counties in the north of Ireland that are still being administered by the United Kingdom. So obviously, Irish nationalists have been lobbying for this to be changed, that Ireland control all of its former territory, all of the island of Ireland. How should libertarians think about the problem? Because we aren't, I think it's easy to look at it straightforwardly and say, okay, this is Irish. It should be Irish. It should be controlled by an Irish state or the Irish people. But there's also this population, the Ulstermen, the Irish Protestants, that do not want the British to leave. Do you think, one, should they have a say, and two, how do we negotiate this problem between these two Irish populations?
Well, I don't. The honest answer is I don't know, and it's something I've thought about a lot. And looking at it from different points of view, like when I look at a map of Ireland, I see it's surrounded by water, and I think, well, this is one country, it's one land, and by right, then it should be governed by one people. But there's not just one people on the island, as you've mentioned. And as a libertarian, I don't think that the government we have is competent to run the 26 counties that they do have, and giving them another 6 counties, like, that's just like giving them more place to mess with. And just to maybe clear up a little bit, so Northern Ireland now has its own parliament. It's
Stormont.
Stormont, yeah, and they supposedly do power sharing. And part of the reason why it's still it remained part of Britain when Ireland got independence is because of the demographics that were there. That you're right, there was a lot of Ulstermen who are unionists, we call them, or loyalists, and they, part of their identity, it's embedded into who they are as people, is that they're part of the British Empire, and they don't want to break away from that. It's so integral to their identity that I believe that for them, if there was a united Ireland, it would be like a death of their own identity. And it's a very precarious situation because there's been a war up there for my whole life, and okay, they say it's like the troubles are over, but the sentiments are still there. And I had a very good history teacher in school, and he told me that told us that the loyalists have this sort of doomsday scenario, which is United Ireland, and if that happens, we probably would be looking at a civil war again. So what we have up there at the moment is a truce. It's not really a peace in the true sense of the word. Um, and then on the flip side, you have the Irish nationalists who they believe, like the Republicans, that the War of Independence was never truly won. And why should it be? Why should it be won as long as Ireland is still under any type of foreign dominion, any type of foreign control? And that's an issue that is like very hard to resolve. That's why it's still there. Interestingly, like you'll find that people draw a lot of parallels with Israel and Palestine, where if you go up to Northern Ireland and you visit these different areas, these different estates, you will see in the Catholic estates, you'll see Palestinian flags flying, and in the loyalist estates, you'll see Israeli flags flying, which is just a curious kind of parallel that people draw there. And it's a sense of that, Ireland will never be free until it's truly free. And there's a part in my heart, I feel that way. But then I have a master's in politics, philosophy, and economics. When I start to think about it academically and like, okay, how would that actually look, and what would the process that you need to go through that would not exclude the population that are also Irish, but they have a different religion and have a different history. Now, one of the twists, I think, the cruel twists of history is that, well, we call these people Ulster Scots, the kind of the settlers, the colonists, planters who came in and under the Tudor dynasties kind of set up plantations there. And of course, you had like the Battle of the Boyne, which is, I think, the era that you were mentioning with the wars, when William of Orange, who's not even British, he's Dutch, the House of Orange is Dutch, leads them and wins a Battle of the Boyne. And that was kind of like a very decisive moment in Irish history as well, against the Catholics and the Protestants. And this is why the Orange Men exist, because it's wearing a sash to celebrate William of Orange, who was a Dutch king. So it's like, it's interesting. And it's why our flag is green, white, and orange as well. It's supposed to be peace between the Orange Men, or the loyalists, and the nationalists, the Greens. So the question is, and it's a hard one to answer, but this is not the question you asked me, but this is how I phrase it, is that like, how can we make, what sort of Ireland needs to exist where those people don't feel marginalized and alienated, that they can feel like that they're part of Ireland too. And this is why the United Irishmen are such an interesting study, because they were somehow trying to make it that, a type of Irishness that wasn't based on religion, that you had Catholics and Protestants who were both fighting for this idea of a free Ireland. So it's a very tricky subject, and I don't know enough. I don't feel like I'm qualified to speak on it, because I never lived in Northern Ireland, and I have friends from there, and obviously, like, I've grown up in Ireland and we've learned about it. But I am always cautious talking about it, because I'm worried that I'm going to say something that just shows my my lack of awareness of what's really like.
Yeah, it's very complicated. I've got back and forth on who to support over the years. Even as a libertarian, I thought that both sides have at different times had the right of it. My friend in Springtime of Nations, Byron, his big solution is the Republicans don't necessarily want the Ulstermen to not live in Ireland, or potentially not even not have their own government, but the existence of the British control is what they have the biggest objection to. So something like Northern Ireland could be even an independent state as long as it's a republic and not part of the
Mm.
British Empire.
Well, I think that people would still have issue with that, but that's, I mean, if we want to tease this out a little bit more, I'm libertarian. That's my views, and so I believe in the right to self-determination of small nations, of small people, like, you know, of small groups of people who want to have self-determination. My ideal system for Ireland would be one that sort of reverts back to how it was in early Ireland, where you have more local control. And the higher, how I would love to see the government in Ireland is that the higher position you have, the less authority you have to actually make decisions. So that would bring it back to like the more polycentric system that we had before. So local government really should have more power than it has. And in a national government, like the office of the president today, has very little power in Ireland. It's not like in the States or in other countries, like they're literally just signing the laws. And the only power that they have is to not sign a law that's deemed unconstitutional. Now, there's a debate over that, whether they should be like challenging unjust laws a little bit more, but they don't. But if you had it like provincial sort of, you have like local government, and then above that you had provincial governments that had less power, and then a sort of a federal government that had even less power. That's a system that I could get behind, and that's a system that would be theoretically like reflective of the different types of people, not just between the Catholics and the Protestants, but what about the people from Cork and the people from Dublin? They're very different from each other, right? They have different sense of humor, they have different like mannerisms, they have different things that matter to them. And so that ultimately, like, that's what I would love to see, but that sort of a solution is just a million miles away from, you know, the reality of how things actually work. So it's just interesting to think about, but I don't think we're going to see anything like that in my lifetime, unfortunately.
Yeah, that is unfortunate. It seems intractable, and the situation, as I understand it, in Northern Ireland itself, the political situation seems to just be getting a worse. Um, the Unionists, they like dropped out of the first premiership. There's all kinds of shenanigans going on there, and there's an upcoming election which may reshift the different battle lines.
Yeah. Well, we've seen like, sorry, like in the 60s and 70s, like the gerrymandering happening, which is when the boundary lines of a district are redrawn and reshaped. So it would make sure that there would just be majority Protestants in an area. But by birth rates, over time, like there's Catholics tended to have more children. It's not so much the case anymore, but they tended to have more children than Protestants. So there is this kind of idea that eventually the majority population of Ulster, of Northern Ireland, would be majority Catholic, and then they'd eventually like vote their way out of this. So there was a lot of like civil rights issues for Catholics, like getting access to the same, you know, benefits that the loyalists would have, or even access to education. And there was like definite policy driven, yeah, driven by British policy, rules that were changed in order to kind of make sure that the Catholics would be in a minority in certain areas, so that there would always be loyalists being voted in. I don't know how the demographic is right now, but I think for like most people today, it's kind of like the horseshoe theory, right? You have the two extremes at either end of the horseshoe who are closer to each other, you know, in terms of what they really like. And what I mean here is like extremist nationalists and extremist unionists tend to be more in common with each other than most of the rest of the population. So you have these kind of two polar extremes. And then as you get closer to the center, most people mix with each other. Most people are not holding on to grudges, and they just want to get on with life, like, you know, in the modern age. And like people are not, Catholics are no longer discriminated from going to university and things like that. And, you know, people get along just fine for the most part. But there are two like aspects of the community that are still, and they, you know, they still have that anger towards one another, this kind of animosity. And both of them have their legends and their, you know, they have their heroic people who fell in battle that they that they draw murals to, and so on, that, you know, I don't know how true reconciliation can happen here. But if you wanted to explore it, I think that, well, the Brehon Law gives us a kind of an approach. And I do have a friend, well, someone that I know up there who worked in the Justice Department for Northern Ireland, and she worked in the restorative justice. And this is like more for community policing, like it wouldn't be for very serious crimes, but for like petty theft and things like that, where if a young person has done some petty theft, that they would have this process of dialogue with the victim, and talking to the victim and hearing what the victim has to say, and having really focusing on reconciliation. Now, that is something that restorative justice, restitution, does exist up there in Northern Ireland, not so much in Ireland as a kind of an office that's in charge of it, but really it's people are hurt, you know, like this war that's lasted for so long has caused a lot of pain, and I'm sure both sides feel like they have a right to be the way that they are. And the only way to kind of, I think, heal this is to have reconciliation, have some sort of dialogue between the communities, facilitated dialogue between the communities, so that they can grieve together and maybe imagine a new Ireland, reimagine the state that they live in, reimagine how things can be done. And in Stormont, with the two political parties, they haven't been doing anything, you know, like they're both elected half and half pretty much, but they can't agree on anything. So they're not doing anything for the people, because they can't, they just won't agree on anything. And in a sense, it's a good example for us libertarians of saying, like, well, you know, government is kind of dysfunctional in the first place. So what's left? Well, you can't really rely on the government to be the one that's going to come up with the solutions, how to reconcile, how do we heal, how do we grow. It's going to have to come from the individuals, the communities, you know, that are affected by these issues.
Yeah, I agree. I have one kind of tangent question I want to ask you, just because you seem like you would have a satisfactory answer to this. The IRA as it exists, the PIRA as it existed in the Troubles, considered itself a left-wing political party. And Sinn Féin, which is seen as its political wing, it's far left or whatever, democratic socialist. The original IRA is a really confusing thing, at least from how I have been able to read about its political views outside of solving the Irish question with Irish independence, because you have people like Eamon de Valera who later become like very conservative, but you also have people, I mean, and even de Valera, these guys were all involved in the Easter Rising and in the Citizens Army, which was a left-wing group, an explicitly Marxist or socialist, at least, group. Is the IRA simply not left-wing or right-wing, at least in the founding years, or am I missing something?
Yeah, there's a lot of people out there who I think would be able to answer this question much better than I am, because I've tended to focus on periods of history prior to this, because there's a lot, as I said, there's a lot of people who do focus on the more modern history from, like, 19th, 20th century. And it's the easy answer to this is like, I don't know, but I do kind of get a sense of what you're talking about, because it's something I've noticed myself. For example, like James Connolly, I think he might have been reaching for that name. He was somebody who was like the father of the socialist workers movement in Ireland. Now, we have to put things into context and the proper place and time. The Russian October Revolution was in 1917, and we had our Easter Rising in 1916. The world had not yet seen the horrors of what Soviet and what Marxism and what that would do. They didn't have a reference. They didn't think that it was going. They didn't know that it could go so horribly wrong as it did under the Soviet Union. And so I think there's a little bit of like to forgive them a little bit for, from our point of view in modern history, with the hindsight that we have. And also, this was an island of peasant workers. What other type of rebellion should happen if not a workers' rebellion? Now, I can kind of empathize with the sentiments of the time. In 1913, so we're on the way up to the 1916 rising. There was a thing called the lockout. There was a massive strike that happened all across the country, where all the workers put down their tools and they stopped working. And at the time, it was like, who were they protesting against? Well, who owned the factories? It was the British Protestants, and they were the workers. And so I can totally understand why these, like what we call today lefty sort of like policies, were so attractive to them at the time, because it made sense to them. And even as little unknown, like a lesser known part of Irish history, is that there was the Limerick Soviet in County Limerick in the west of the country. For, I think it would only last in 2 weeks. It only lasted 2 weeks or something like that. They declared the Limerick Soviet. And when the Proclamation of Independence was read out in 1916, very few governments acknowledged this. But you know who did? The Russians did. The Russian government did. This Marxists in Russia recognized Ireland's cry of sovereignty. So there must have been a sort of an affinity, but at the time, that made sense to them, because they were workers and they were peasants, and it was this sort of terminology that's used by Marx would have been probably very apparent to them. Now, with the IRA, and you're right, there was different formulations of the IRA, and if we're talking back in the 1916 era, we also had the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And I think that like most organizations, like if you go to any workplace, you're going to have a good kind of mixture of political views. I think that was the case for them as well. But like what united them was they wanted the United Ireland. It wasn't United Ireland at the time. It was more like they wanted Ireland to be free and independent. That's a better way to say it. And some of them were socialist and some of them were conservatives. And that wasn't, I don't think, a big issue at the time. Now, in the modern IRA, so we're talking in the last, 80 years or so, from the 50s and so on. I think that the part of the reason, what I've read and what I've watched some documentaries about it, part of the reason there were these breakaway groups that became like the Continuity IRA and the Real IRA and Provisional IRA and things like this. Part of the reason there was splits was because there was elements within it that started to become too Marxist and too socialist, and were kind of missing the original main goal, which was that Ireland should be free. And then afterwards, we can figure out how we want to govern it. When you look at Sinn Féin today, for your listeners, the word Sinn Féin means ourselves. And this wasn't just a political party, it was more of a cultural movement in the early days of the Free State, was that Ireland wanted to, the Sinn Féin message means ourselves, and it means like self-dependence. We will have our own exports and our own industry, and we don't need to rely on anybody else. And I kind of think that might be a necessary step for young nations to go through, and that this self-dependence, extreme self-reliance, and that's where Sinn Féin came from. The Sinn Féin party of back then ended at some point. I can't recall the reasons why, but then we have a new Sinn Féin political party that exists to this day. And I often joke that say, yeah, ourselves is the right name for them, because they do whatever is like right for them as a political party. And it's kind of difficult for people to gauge where they sit on the political spectrum. Now it's almost like they just sit wherever. I think they're kind of more populist now. You see with Sinn Féin, they are taking up the mantle of like what you might consider in America like lefty or like left-wing sort of policies. that have nothing to do with United Ireland or have nothing to do with republicanism, but they're popular. And so I guess what I'm getting at here is that Sinn Féin have never been in power. This modern political party have never been in power, and nobody really knows what would they be like if they were in power, because they change based on the moods of the day and so on. And a lot of the older people I know who were into Sinn Féin, like a lot of people have turned away from Sinn Féin because they feel like they became something else and they kind of lost the main purpose was, which is to advocate politically for United Ireland. Now, I do know that to this day they won't take their seats in Westminster, because if they're elected, they can take a seat in Westminster. So they protest the British regime in that way. But the main thing that they seem to be interested in at the moment is like, the LGBT issues, immigration issues, transgender issues, these sorts of things that would be in political sense characterized as left wing, rather than the unification of Ireland with getting the 6 counties back.
Great. Well, thank you for that answer. I think I think we could go into all of this stuff in much more detail. We could spend hours talking, but I will thank you for your time, Kevin. If you'd like to plug, obviously, Brehon Academy stuff, feel free to do so.
Cool. Yeah, so if anybody wants to like learn a bit more about my work, or specifically to go into that more detail on the early Irish period, what I call Gaelic Ireland, then the best place to do that would be to go to brehonacademy.org, where it's you'll get like blog posts, you'll be able to access some online courses and videos there. And I'm probably most active then on Facebook under Brehon Academy, and YouTube. Brehon Academy is the name of the channel. There's over 100 videos on YouTube. Oh, and if people want to sign up on the website, brehonacademy.org, you can access the online library, which has over 120 books. So it's like you're definitely going to find something there for any of the topics that we've brushed against and much more. You'll be able to find more details there and kind of go into a deeper study. You can also reach out to me, Kev at brehonacademy.org, if you have any questions, or if you're doing research and not quite sure where to look. I'm happy to try and nudge you in the right direction.
All right, thank you. This has been Adrian with Springtime Nations and Kevin Flanagan of the Brehon Academy.
Thank you very much.